You're listening to The Second Level on SB Nation Radio.
And on SBNationRadio.com.
Presented by Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. From the O'Reilly Auto Parts Studios, with way more than the scores, here's Eytan Shander.
We got one game under our belt in the preseason, so football action is there. I know a lot of people were scouting for fantasy football drafts and dailies, your yearly league as well. So we go to an expert in Houston, bring in Jerry Bow. Jerry Bow knows on Twitter, ESPN 97.5, host of the Moneyline 97.5, and as well, we talk a lot fantasy football with Jerry. Eytan Shander, SB Nation Radio. Appreciate the time tonight, brother.
Football is in the air. It feels good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does. Now, let me just ask you right off the bat, at what point do you normally draft when it comes to – I know that we'll get to the dailies and the daily strategy, but when it comes to the yearlies, I guess there are people that still play the yearlies as well. What point do you normally draft? Like, what's too early, what's too late, if it ever is too late?
I personally like to wait till the very last week because of the injury factors, but – the NFL we playing now, we know that last game is basically a dress rehearsal for the non-starters, let's say. So right around after that third preseason game is any time good after that for me.
All right, and what's the biggest mistake that you see people constantly make when it comes to drafting, be it position, be it one guy that people constantly go to, like stop drafting Julio Jones, he's not going to score any touchdowns. What do you see as far as the biggest mistake, usually, Jerry, that people make, and that's why they lose these leagues?
So there's a few, but for starters, there's always that guy that shows up and says, I'm not drafting X player no matter what. Everyone has a price on their head. Everyone becomes value at some point or another. Another mistake is people that look at recency bias and they look at last year and where a player ended. And whenever you have 1 year that's an outlier, or you have one player that didn't finish the season, but their fantasy points per game was something that could put them in the top 5, but their overall points for the season were outside of the top 15 because they only played 10 games. That's the stuff that you have to look out for. You have to look out for opportunity. Who's missing? Where targets are missing from a certain wide receiver group? Where are those targets going to go? And that's where you can capitalize during a draft.
All right, so I guess based off of that, I'm curious, two names that could possibly regress from a fantasy standpoint. And one is going to be more of a risk because I don't think that it was any type of fluke. Despite not being able to put up the same numbers that he did last year, it would not be a regression. It's just going to be impossible. And that's Pat Mahomes. The other is from a more physical/injury standpoint, and that's Todd Gurley. Do you anticipate either or both regressing a little bit?
Of course, and something I like to use is a term that goes by regression to the mean, meaning, and it could be positive or negative. In the Mahomes case, I see negative regression. There's no way that he's going to go out there and throw 50 and 12 again. I just don't see it with those 5,000 yards. That was just something outlandish. But then if you look at players that can maybe do it again, and you will see maybe positive regression to the mean, is like Andrew Luck, for example, or Deshaun Watson, a player that didn't have more than 19 pass attempts for 6 weeks straight after he injured his ribs during that Cowboys game, but he still ended as the 5th overall quarterback. This year in particular, I want to talk about Watson real quick because last season, the Texans had the easiest schedule going into the season. So whenever you look at fantasy, you look at game script and you say, if my team's going to be in competitive games, maybe they'll be throwing more. If they're behind, they'll be throwing more. If they have an easier schedule, then the game script will maybe tell you that they'll be winning more games, and then they're reluctant to throw. With Watson, last year was the easiest. Well, guess what? This year is the hardest. So I plan on him having to throw more. And if you're telling me that he didn't throw for 6 games straight over 19 attempts and he still ended 5th, add that to the running capability, I think that Deshaun Watson will be the number 1 overall scoring quarterback in fantasy football this year.
Wow. Is that enough to draft him higher than normal? And I don't know where you normally draft quarterbacks. Maybe we should start there. And is it enough to take maybe a leap on that and draft him a little higher than normal in leagues?
Well, Mahomes is going overall around the 27.2. So depending on how many people you have in your league, but let's say standard-wise, let's say it's about 12 teams. He's going right when it starts open, that third round, second round, somewhere around there, top of the second, or bottom of the second, top of the third, excuse me. But, again, if you wait, because there's always going to be that one guy that's going to say, this is Mahomes, he's going to do it again, we're going for 50 touchdowns, and he's going to overspend. And if you wait, it's not even actually Watson that goes next. It's Andrew Luck, and he's going a whole 3 rounds later. So if you wait, that's where you can capitalize, because there's going to be that guy that's going to stick his head out and say, hey, I'm taking him now.
What about 2 names I'm going to throw at you that I think have some unpredictability surrounding them? One coming back from injury, the other playing in a backup role, probably better than we've ever seen anybody play in a backup role, but now as a starter. Jerry Bow joining us at Jerry Bow Knows on Twitter, host of the Moneyline 97.5, ESPN 97.5 in Houston. Eytan Shander, SB Nation Radio. Let's start with Carson Wentz. I know that the only time in his career that he's been healthy in the offseason, he had that MVP bid that was cut short due to injury. And then I want to get your thoughts on Foles. But let's start with Carson Wentz, and as far as a guy who I think everybody, when healthy, believes he can be an MVP, but there's also the injury concern.
This is prime setup for him to be successful. Look at the weapons he has around him. Now, one thing that this year brings to my attention is the success that Philadelphia has playing 12-man personnel, and that's with being able to run out Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, which that was what Wentz loved to go to, was Zach Ertz, right? So I think that this year is the Eagles' year. And whenever you have that kind of feel behind a team, then that quarterback is obviously who I'm going to play. I believe that Jordan Howard in the backfield is not so much in the passing game, because we know that he used to lead the league in drops for wide receivers, or running backs, but Miles Sanders. They bring back Darren Sproles. You add Deshaun Jackson. You even have the young Whiteside out there, 2 tight ends. I believe that Carson Wentz will end up as a top 5 quarterback for the year, and he's being drafted a little bit outside of that. He's going overall as the 8th quarterback drafted off the board, somewhere around pick 84 overall.
All right, real quick, and I'm really glad that you brought that up as far as the 12 personnel, because I'm curious when you see a guy like Dallas Goedert, and I know the tight end is probably more of an inconsequential position than not, but I'm curious when you look at the actual position of Dallas Goedert, be it where he's drafted to what he can do. I would imagine that Zach Ertz is going to be the sexy pick to go high, but Goddard's probably going to have a pretty good year. Do you see that as well?
Yes, I see that, and that's the problem with people overdrafting Zach Ertz. With tight end position this year, I see it as in tiers. Travis Kelce sitting all alone. I see George Kittle as that second tier with Zach Ertz a little bit behind him. Now, who finished 4th last year? Someone that I know is going to drop down, and we talked about negative regression, Eric Ebron. I do not see him throwing up 13 touchdowns now that they added a Devin Funchess back there. But, again, 20th overall, Dallas Goedert, when somebody goes to draft this year, they're going to say they're going to take all the sexy names. We remember going into last year, everyone was all over Trey Burton. He got off to a slow start. People got off of him. But what about a Vance McDonald that ended up 10th overall? You lose Antonio Brown, which is over 140 targets. Who's that ball going to go to? Vance McDonald's going to come up big, and that's where you start getting a lot of value in the tight end position. I talked about earlier about looking points per game instead of the overall points per season. Make sure that you circle Evan Ingram and O.J. Howard. Evan Ingram, 11 games only, but he averaged 11.3 points per game. That would have made him a top 7 guy. Instead, he ended up 13th. O.J. Howard ended up 15th, but he averaged 12.1 points per game. That would have made him a top 5 tight end. So keep that in mind. Look at O.J. Howard and Ingram late in your draft.
What do you think of Nick Foles as either a quarterback that you can draft in later rounds to start, or just as far as somebody who's probably going to have lower value than Mahomes or Brady or Wentz, fill in the blank, on the dailies?
Let's look at not only did they change the culture by him, but they also changed it by bringing in DeFilippo. Why did DeFilippo get fired from Minnesota because he wouldn't run the ball enough. He had over 600 pass attempts. That's what his quarterback had. You can even look back at the times in Cleveland, and whenever he had Josh McCown and all them, he still had over 600 attempts for his quarterback. So, again, I don't see how he changes that. Once you get this old, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, right? So I see them throwing, although I don't like the weapons too much. I do have to. I see them throwing more than less. You know what I mean? And I don't really trust Leonard Fournette back there. So I see that team throwing, and I see him surpassing his over-under total for his yards is actually 3,800 if you're into the betting type of props, and I'm seeing that as an over bet.
Jerry Bow, ESPN 97.5 at Jerry Bow Knows, host of the Moneyline 97.5, ESPN 97.5 in Houston, Eytan Shander, SB Nation Radio. Give me a guy that people just can't wait to draft early in these yearly leagues, and you know that will be all over on the dailies as well, that you wouldn't play, that you'd stay away from, that you wouldn't draft, maybe even somebody that's routinely getting drafted in the first round that you would just stay away from?
That's tough because this year it's the top four are interchangeable. Everyone's got that Barkley, McCaffrey, Kamara, Elliott. Then after that, you start wondering, do I go ahead and tap into the wide receivers, which opens the world of Hopkins and Adams. But someone that I see regressing, and I know that he came out publicly and said, draft me number one, is Le'Veon Bell. He's used to playing in a different system. He's coming from a better team. He's coming to a different offensive line. I just don't see him being that guy that he says he's going to be. And he's being drafted 8th overall. And to draft him, you're having to pass up that second tier of wide receivers because I classify tier 1 as Hopkins, Adams, and tier 2 as the Julio Jones, Michael Thomas area, right around that area. So are you going to get Le'Veon Bell, or do you get maybe his counterpart that ended up replacing him, James Conner, coming off that big year? Do you get Joe Mixon, someone that has such a big market share of that offense? I don't know if you can pass up on those kind of guys. Do you pass up on Tyreek Hill? I don't know if you can do that to get Le'Veon Bell and that 8th spot. And that you have to kind of gamble. You don't know what we're going to see. And to take a gamble with your first-round pick, you can't win your draft with your first-round pick, but you can lose it.
That's a great strategy, man. All right, real quick, Jerry, I'm curious. Is there a player right now that you've been talking about on interviews like this show and others that either nobody's talking enough about or at all that you're really confident will have a breakout season this year? Any position that of impact?
There's a few out there. The Chris Godwin impact, because if we look
like that.
Yeah, and people have been talking about him. In the day and age we live in now, there's no such thing as a sleeper, right? Because as soon as someone mentions a sleeper, everyone's already on top of it. Now you say, when is he of value? And with someone like Godwin, and now Adam Humphries is missing, and then now they bring in a new offense. And if you look back at last year, they were 4th in passing attempts. So what's going to change there? I don't see anything changing. You still got, and now you'll have a full 16 games, hopefully, of that O.J. Howard that we said went off as a top 5 tight end in that small game sample. That's what he would have been if he would have played the full 16. Give me that offense, anybody on it, and that's where I see Godwin. Another one that I see here is whenever you talk about running backs, people talk about handcuffs. Well, a handcuff that I see that is not even a true handcuff. He's going to get the ball inside the 5 is Latavius Murray in New Orleans. Kamara has never been a 20-type carry guy, not even in college. So what happens whenever they give him the ball 15, 16 times? At one point or another, Latavius Murray is going to be asked to play that Mark Ingram role. And when he does, that means he'll get those goal line carries. Give me Latavius Murray. And if Kamara gets injured, he becomes a big, big factor.
A lot of fun, Jerry. Really appreciate the time, man, and great stuff on the fantasy world. I know that it's going to be a busy season, so we'll definitely check in with you again, man. Appreciate the time tonight.
Thanks for having me.
You got it. Jerry Bow, ESPN 97.5, at Jerry Bow Knows, Moneyline 97.5, ESPN 97.5 in Houston. Some draft strategy to some sleeper players that Jerry dropped. Will react next. Eytan Shander, SB